The John Lebang Show has been known to make people laugh, sing, think, scream, throw things in rage, and generally lose their minds. Listener discretion is advised. Good friend is joining us once again, Mr. Derek Shelmerdine, author of Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. Derek, how's life treating you?
It's very good at the moment, John. It's great to be back talking to you. And what a great topic this is, the Rolling Stones. Wow.
Yeah, we've got a lot to discuss, so why don't we hit right into it?
Okay. I mean, the background of the band's really interesting. I mean, it all starts with Brian Jones. It was very much Brian Jones that instigated and created the Rolling Stones. He started out in the late 50s as a sax player and guitar in local trad jazz bands in his local Bath, West London, west of England area. And trad jazz is the British take on Dixieland jazz. And he did famously play sax in a band called the Ramrods as well, which was more of a rock and roll band. Because, of course, the sax was a big instrument in rock and roll. And in a completely parallel path, Mick and Keith had actually been to primary school together, the sort of 4 to 11-year-olds. And famously, on the 17th of October 61, they met on Dartford Station. And there's actually now a plaque on Dartford Station commemorating the fact that they met, and the Rolling Stones sort of started from there, which isn't altogether true, but they certainly met on the station. They actually Mick and Keith formed a band called Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys with their little mate Dick Taylor. And they did actually record a demo tape around the sort of end of 61, and I think that's floating around for anybody who really wants to get into the early Stones stuff. But I had a fabulous Facebook moment. Well, I did this posting about the fact that I said Brian Jones played with Paul Pond in a group called Thunder Odin and the Big Secret, which I think is one of life's great names. Paul Pond, of course, was the guy that changed his name to Paul Jones and was the lead singer of Manfred Mann. And I got a Facebook reply from him that said that Brian Jones never actually played in Thunder Odin. Never actually joined the band. Paul Jones invited him to, but he declined. So I thought that was it's quite nice to get a Facebook thing from Paul Jones of Manfred Mann.
And it's showing that your book's getting out there and people are starting to catch on to what you're doing. That's a great thing.
Oh, absolutely. And Charlie Watts is actually running yet another parallel course. He's with a band called Alexis Corners Blues Incorporated. Now, they are very, very revered British blues band. They're very much blues pioneers. I mean, he was going since the sort of mid-50s. And then Brian Jones we're now at about March 62. He formed his first lineup with a guy called Brian Knight, Jeff Bradford, and Ian Stewart, whose name will pop up a lot over the next few minutes.
Now, when you're saying first lineup, this is like the early days of the Rolling Stones?
Well, this is yeah, if you like. And the only actual Rolling Stone in there is Brian Jones. But you could say that Ian Stewart is very much a Rolling Stone as well, though a lot of people won't have actually heard of him, and we'll find out why as we sort of progress through the story. Now, Brian Jones was actually playing with Alexis Corners Blues Incorporated by the spring of 62, and he was calling himself Elmo Jones after Elmo James, which I thought was good.
Yep.
And Mick and Keith famously met Brian and Charlie, who were playing in Blues Incorporated at a gig. at the Ealing Club in West London. I mean, there are so many bands sort of in this part of the story. Now, around now, which is the mid-1962, Brian Knight from this first lineup, he went off and formed his own band, Blues by Six, and Jeff Bradford, one of the first lineup, went and joined him, and Charlie Watts actually joined them as well. He left Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated to join Blues by Six. And Charlie Watts was replaced in Blues Incorporated by Ginger Baker.
The famous Ginger Baker.
Absolutely, from Cream. And Mick Jagger, by now, he'd met them at the club. By the summer of '62, he was a regular lead singer with Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated. And because Brian Knight, Jeff Bradford had moved on, Mick Jagger and Keith Richard and Dick Taylor from Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys, they joined Ian Stewart and Brian Jones. So this is what's usually thought of as the Brian Jones second lineup. And this is where the Stones are really starting to take shape. The drummer at the time was a guy called Tony Chapman from a band called the Cliftons. And really famous date in the Rock and Roll Diary is July the 12th, 1962. And that was when they played their first ever gig as the Rolling Stones without the G at the Marquee Club in London. They took their name from a Muddy Waters single. It was the second single ever released on Chess. And what happened was the Blues Incorporated got an invitation to play on BBC Radio's Jazz Club, very prestigious. So Alexis Corner said, "Hey guys, why don't you take your Rolling Stones band and fill in for us at the Marquee?" So that was how they got their big breakup, in a way. But there's a great story about the drummer, because urban legend often has it that Mick Avery, the Kinks drummer, was the drummer on that day. But interestingly enough, if you go to the Stones website, it says that it was Mick Avery. But if you go to a website called Cast Off Kinks, which is a lot of people who used to play in the Kinks, who formed a band called Cast Off Kinks, in an interview Mick Avery gave, he said he never played at that gig. He rehearsed with the Stones, but never actually played with them.
Yeah, I remember you talking about this before. It's an interesting little story.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. That is who was on the seat that day. Most people think it was probably Tony Chapman, but Dick Taylor left shortly after. He formed the Pretty Things, who went on to some really good stuff.
And he went back to guitar.
That's right. I mean, what happened was he played guitar in Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys, but when they joined Brian Jones, because there were so many guitarists, he moved to bass, and he was never really that happy with bass guitar. So I think it's quite possible that if he'd been the bass guitarist in that early version of the Rolling Stones, he might never have left to form his own band, Pretty Things, so we might never have had the Pretty Things. It's one of never quite knowing life stories.
Yeah, the what ifs.
Exactly. To put it into context, we're now at sort of October '62, and that's when the Beatles released their first single in the UK, Love Me Do. So you can see the Stones are still very much in their early days. They're haven't even got their full lineup together yet. But when it really started happening for them was they met a guy called Giorgio Gamelski, who was quite a big wheel in the early R&B days in London, and he formed a club called the Crawdaddy Club in West London, and that was one of the real pioneers of R&B in London. And Charlie Watts, again, he played in a band called Dave Hunt's R&B band, and they were the first resident band there at the Crawdaddy. And that band also featured Ray Davies from time to time.
From the Kinks.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see there are quite a lot of interesting people who were all sort of getting together in different bands at different times. But the final name really comes in for the first time is Bill Wyman. He famously auditioned on the 7th of December for the Stones, and he's written this great blues history book. And in it, he tells the story of his audition. And he says, he went there with he says he had a great big pair of Vox AC30 amplifiers and an echo unit. And he reckons the only reason they took him on was because of enormous wardrobe-sized cabinet with the 18-inch speaker.
Got to have that power, man. Got to have that power. Looked great.
Absolutely. AC30. I mean, there's a name to conjure with. It's amazing when you look back at these photographs of bands in the sort of early 60s, how small the back line is and how that really changed over the next 5 or 6 years.
But the arena size changed with it.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because the venues just kept getting bigger and bigger. Because the venues were very small back in those days. They were just halls, basically. But I mean, another interesting thing is Tony Chapman, the drummer, he was from a band called the Cliftons, and that was where Bill Wyman came from. That was how Bill Wyman came to know of the band. But he famously played his last gig on the 11th of January, 63. And that's when Charlie Watts joined. But it's interesting, he had the same sort of fate as Pete Best in the Beatles and Doug Sandon in The Who. You know, played with a band while they were getting it all together and just on the verge of becoming famous, and the poor old drummer gets kicked out. I mean, Charlie Watts, he joined in the sort of January of 63, and now the classic five are there. Plus Ian Stewart, he was the pianist, and he was still very much part of the band by the January 63. But Charlie Watts, that was when he stopped being part-time. In all these other bands he played in, he was still a graphic designer, with a full 9 till 5 days a week job. But the Stones persuaded him that it's time to move on now and become a proper drummer, as it were. And they became the house band at the Crawdaddy, and Jojo Gomelski became their first manager. So that was he didn't have a contract with them. That would come back to bite him in a few minutes' time.
That's like a verbal contract. That was it, right?
That was it. Yeah, there was no big formal contract, and that's really out of context with most of the rest of the story, where there's so many lawsuits flying around with the rest of their managers, like most of the rock and roll world. But they cut a demo on the 11th of March 63 with a guy called Glyn Johns, who's engineer producer and has been involved with just about everybody. He's done Eric Clapton, The Who, a whole load of people. But that was when they met Andrew Loog Oldham, who effectively was their second manager. He came along to see them with a guy called Eric Easton, who was his partner. They came along to the Crawdaddy. And a few days later, it was April 28, 63, but they became the manager shortly after. And Andrew Loog Oldham decided very much to change their image. And he worked along the lines of he wanted to be the antithesis of the clean-cut Beatles image. So he changed it to this sort of bad boy image with a sort of slogan, would you want your daughter to go out with a Rolling Stone? It was Andrew Oldham that decided that Ian Stewart didn't have the right image for the band. So he moved Ian Stewart off the stage to become the road manager. But interestingly enough, Ian Stewart still plays on an awful lot of records, and apparently he did play in the wings sometimes of concert performances on the piano. But he also decided Oldham decided he wanted to change the focus away from Brian to the frontman, Mick Jagger.
Makes sense, though. He had a presence about him, and still does at this age, that people are drawn to that sort of character.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, because Brian was actually very much. If you watch him, he's very much the sort of musician in the background. And it was Andrew Oldham that decided that Jagger and Richard should become songwriters, which proves to be a very smart move. And that by now, which is sort of June 63, they're starting to get some serious success. I mean, they released their first single in the UK, and that was the Chuck Berry cover of, their cover of Chuck Berry's Come On. That got to 21 in the UK charts. But the second single, Fortune Teller, coupled with Poison Ivy, for some reason that was withdrawn very soon after it was released. So, anybody hunting down collectible British singles, Rolling Stones on Decca, Fortune Teller, and Poison Ivy is well worth checking out.
Is there a story behind why they withdrew that?
No, I've never actually managed to track down why, because that was released actually on the 9th of July, which is only about a month after Come On was released.
Maybe they didn't want to take away from the first single.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. Listening there. Don't go anywhere. The John Lebang Show's going to be right back. Just ask the hillbilly.
That's right. Right after this.
What about me? Maybe next time.
Check out the new book from Derek Shelmerdine,
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
It tells the story of rock and roll from its roots right up until the mid-70s punk.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Not just the music, but also the events that shaped the music.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
It includes the backgrounds to recording sessions, singles, album releases, births and deaths, epic concerts, and festivals.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Shelmerdine has made a painstaking effort to document pretty much every event that would prove significant in shaping popular music.
Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
Purchase the book at www.rock'n'rollunraveled.com. Follow him at Twitter at R&R Unraveled, and look him up on Facebook at Rock'n'Roll Unraveled.
Rock'n'Roll Unraveled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now.
If you are elderly, disabled, receiving SSI or Medicaid, and you have a medical need or require assistance with daily housework, shopping, grooming, medication, you may qualify for housekeeping at no cost. Call now. VIP Home Healthcare, 248-579-3805. VIP Home Healthcare, there when you need them. That's 248-579-3805.
You're listening to the John Lebang Show.
It's a hell of a good time, isn't it?
I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
The only reason that we are still together is that the subtlety of delicate change in the music.
Some of it's old, some of it's new, something borrowed, something brown.
It's the sea of a band that wears makeup, and you've got snakes, and you've got guillotines, and you've got really hard rock, Detroit rock and roll.
I mean, all those groups and people that started off when we were starting off are all still going.
It's funny how many times rock and roll has been dead. Yeah, how many times people have said it's been dead, it just keeps coming back like a bloody phoenix.
Rock and roll!
If you look at their third single, that was actually a Lennon McCartney song. In the UK, their third single was I Want to Be Your Man. So I can imagine, but that wasn't released till November. So you can imagine if it was released in August, they would have pulled it in favour of the fact that they just managed to persuade the Beatles to give them a song, because that was a license to print money in the early 60s, a Lennon McCartney cover.
Sure. You know, and it's interesting that they wanted to be the antithesis of the Beatles, yet they cover one of their songs.
Absolutely. Oh, there's a lot of contradictions in life, I think. But yeah, and it got them to number 12, so I mean, they haven't hit the top spot yet. But one of their big breaks came when they were on a program called Thank You Lucky Stars, a British TV pop music thing, with Gene Pitney. And they heard his song, he heard the Jagger Richards song, My Only Girl, and he liked the words, didn't like the melody, so he reworked the melody, and he released that as That Girl Belongs to Yesterday, and that gave Jagger and Richards their first hit as songwriters, actually on both sides of the Atlantic. They were the songwriters, and that was it. But it was enough really to get the fledgling Jagger Richards songwriting credits a move, because Gene Pitney was very big. I mean, this is late '63. I mean, he'd had a bunch of hits by that particular time. And again, now to put it into context, that was the end of '63. On the 9th of February '64, the Beatles made their famous appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, and that was when things really started to happen for British bands. And in fact, the Stones released their first single, which was the "I Want to Be Your Man," in the States in the February. But this is another interesting one, because it was coupled with a B-side called "Stoned," which didn't prove too popular with various people. So it was withdrawn. It was released, but a copy of that was sold in 2016 for $9,000.
And do we know how many copies were actually still available?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, there wouldn't be a lot. but they do come up every now and again. I was reading a sort of train of a record collecting thing, and there was a discussion about this particular single, and it said, it does occasionally come up, and the last one that was on this particular thread was in 2016. But again, it's a good time to check out the attic for old vinyl 45s and LPs if they've been sitting up there for some years.
Right, because you probably only paid, 45 cents to $1 back then for that 45?
Oh, absolutely.
That's a heck of a profit.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, that's exactly what in the UK, singles at that time were 6 shillings and 4 pence in what the Brits called old money, which is about a third of a pound. And so that would probably have been a little bit less than a dollar at that particular time. So, yeah, absolutely. So a good investment, I think that.
Damn right.
But that was re-released, I Want to Be Your Man, with the Buddy Holly cover of Not Fade Away. And that got the Stones to number 48 on the American charts.
And that was only a month later they did that.
That's right. Yeah, it was pulled very quickly because of the B-side. The whole idea. I think it was more of an issue in America than it was in the UK, though the BBC banned any kind of reference to drugs. But there was a lot of censorship going on right up until the middle end of the 60s. If the lyrics were even vaguely associated with sex or drugs, which is interesting to ponder on nowadays. But their first album in the UK came out in April of '64, and it was just called The Rolling Stones. It was mostly covers, but it included Tell Me, which was a Jagger Richard composition that actually was an early single in the States. But by '64, I mean, they're really motoring. They had their first tour in the June. That Tell Me single was released on the 12th of June, and that got them to number 24. So that was their first real hit. And then they had their first UK number 1 in the summer of '64, and that was still a cover. That was It's All Over Now.
Which was a big thing back then. Everybody would cover everybody else. It's pretty normal, wasn't it?
Oh, very much so. And particularly the British bands, they were all, because these are all covers of American R&B songs, basically, and blues songs. There wasn't an awful lot of songwriting going on. I mean, Billy Fury, one of the big British rock and roll stars, he wrote a lot of his own stuff. But by and large, certainly the bands at this time, they were all doing covers of American R&B songs. But I love this. The Christmas 1964, the Stones took out an ad in the New Musical Express, which was one of the big national music papers at the time. It's still going now. And this was the time when young men were starting to grow their hair long. And they took out an ad, and in the ad it shows a picture of them, and it says, "Happy Christmas to starving hairdressers and their families." Which I thought was very, very generous of them.
Yeah. They think of the people that are losing money at Christmas because everybody's growing their hair.
Absolutely.
I still have my beautiful locks. Not many guys my age do.
Absolutely. I can sympathize there because I've grown mine quite long as well. So it's one of life's pleasant things, I think, to reach the other side of being a youth and still have lots of hair.
Yep, no doubt about that. We won't pick on the bald guys.
No.
So we got past Christmas with the Happy Christmas for starving hairdressers and their families. Now we're moving into 1965, right?
That's right, and starts off pretty much with them falling out with the law. On March the 18th, they famously were returning from a night out, a bunch of them, Mick, Brian and Bill from the Stones with a couple of chums, and they decided to relieve themselves on a garage forecourt wall. Now the garage owner took a dim view of this, and he called the local bobbies, and Mick, Brian and Bill were actually fined for insulting behaviour.
Not indecent exposure, insulting behavior.
Absolutely. Oh yeah. They didn't go too much down that particular fault, but they did find themselves with a small fine.
What was the fine back then for that?
I think it was around about 100. I can't remember offhand. I think it's around about £100, which is not that small, I suppose, in those days.
No, it's pretty hefty.
Yeah, but a dim view was taken by the constabulary and the local magistrates' court. But now, I mean, I thought it'd be interesting to have a look at the actual business deals that arrangements they had with their managers, Andrew Oldham and Alan Klein, because this is now mid-65 when Andrew Oldham decided to appoint Alan Klein as their business manager. Now, this is the same Alan Klein that fell out very much with the Beatles as well. But if you go back to when Andrew Oldham actually struck the original deal with Decca back in 1963 when he signed them up, it's really interesting because Andrew Oldham and Easton, his partner, they negotiated the deal, but the Stones weren't signed directly with Decca. Andrew Oldham and Eric Easton had a company called Impact Sound, and they actually had the deal with Decca. So it was Impact Sound that owned the master tapes, and they actually leased them to Decca. And Impact Sound had a payment of 14% from Decca, and they only gave the Stones 6% of that, so they kept the other 8%. But I thought, a bit of a cheek. On top of the keeping 8% to the Stones 6%, they also charged the Stones a management fee of 25% of the Stones 6% cut.
Man, they made out there. Now, so you're saying Impact Sounds was kind of a proxy. They were the middleman. They would develop bands or something and then just send it to Decca to mass produce?
Yeah, absolutely. The Stones weren't actually signed with Decca. The Stones were signed with Impact Sound. A very smart move on Andrew Oldham's part, because it meant that they owned the master tapes, so they owned the recordings, and this really comes back to bite the Stones later, because coming now to July '65, where we were when we picked this part up, that was when Andrew Oldham hired Alan Klein to be their business manager, because now Andrew Luke Oldham formed his own independent record label, Immediate Records, around this sort of time, and he had a lot of success with other artists on the record label, so he was focusing a lot of his attention on that, and that's why he brought Alan Klein in. But Klein actually then negotiated a new deal with Decca. He cut Eric Easton out completely, so Easton naturally sued him. But now with Klein's deal, the band got 7% and Impact Sound got 7% without any 25% of the Stones cut. But he also set up Gideon Music to actually administer the songs. So what happened basically was when Andrew Luke Oldham sold out, and he sold out because in '67 Mick and Keith got themselves into a drugs bust, and Andrew Oldham decided that he didn't want to get caught up in this, so he fled off to America and left Alan Klein to sort it all out. He did actually get involved. He was involved in the organisation of Monterey, Andrew Oldham, while he was in America, so it wasn't all that bad. But by the end of '67, he'd sold out to Alan Klein. So the whole Impact Sound thing was now owned by Alan Klein. That's why Alan Klein owns the rights to all of the Rolling Stones 1960s back catalogue.
And he makes good money off that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Stones did take him to court and lost. I mean, that is a salutary tale for any young band to really understand how their management contracts work.
Yeah, it's a tough business out there. And back then, you had less information as the artist than you do now, and you still can make mistakes today. So, exactly. Anybody listening that's in a band, you can learn something by just listening to what's going on right here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Stones weren't actually aware that they were having 25% of their 6% taken away. I mean, I suppose they were just really happy to be moving into the big time, but so many 60s bands got ripped off. But by the mid-65, that's when it really started to go for the Stones. I mean, Satisfaction, one of their absolute classics. They still perform now, often as our last song. That was the first US number one, and it was the fourth British number one. But they were still the bad boys of rock and roll, still in the middle of 65. They were playing a gig in Berlin, and Mick Jagger decided he'd goose step across the stage and literally caused a riot.
He caused a riot by goose stepping? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is Berlin, so in the mid-60s. I mean, the armed forces were still very much in the country.
Oh, boy.
But also 65 was one of my great moments. The Stones were doing one of their package tours with a bunch of other bands, and they reached Chester on the 1st of October, and I was there at the concert.
Pretty awesome, man.
Oh,
I've never got to see the band, and you're talking about seeing the band in their, I won't say infancy, but their early childhood.
Oh, absolutely. It was the Satisfaction tour, and the girls were, as soon as the Stones came on, everybody stood up, and every girl in the theatre, it'd be about 1,000-seater, 1,500 maybe, seater. Essentially, a lot of the gigs at that time were these package tours, and they were in cinemas. And one day a week, they'd have live music, so they'd take the screen away and the bands would perform. So there were great venues to see a band at. And I remember that as soon as it started, all the girls screamed through the entire 20-minute set. I mean, the earlier bands only played 15-minute sets. You had about 6 different bands on in the same evening. Absolutely incredible.
Hey, you. Yeah, you. Listening there. Don't go anywhere. The John Lebang Show is going to be right back. Just ask the hillbilly.
That's right. Right after this.
What about me? Maybe next time.
Pane in the Glass, commercial and residential window cleaning. For a beautiful, sparkling shine that's crystal clear, call Pane in the Glass Window Cleaning. You can find them on Facebook at Pane in the Glass.
Hey, man, it's at the bottom of the hour, man. Do you know where your kids are, man?
Now, how long did it take them to move from band to band in between sets? Because today you get about 15 minutes and that's it.
Yeah, it was very quick. I mean, they'd almost always use the same drum kit, and it would just be a case. And they were very much simpler backlines and setups. And they just moved very quickly from one act to the next, because the whole thing had started about 7 and finished at about 10.
Oh, nice 3 hours of music there.
Oh, it was brilliant. They were good fun. I saw some good bands in those days in that kind of environment. But it's really starting now to become the more mature band when you get to early 66, when they released Aftermath. And that was the first album with all Jagger and Richard compositions. And a bit like the Beatles, the albums being released in the States weren't necessarily the same as the albums being released in the UK. What you tended to have was more albums. Like with Beatles, you had more singles released in America than you did in the UK. But that particular album, Aftermath, was released within a couple of months of itself, either side of around April 66. And it was originally going to be called Could You Walk on Water?
Oh, the album was.
Yeah, when they were recording it, the working title was Could You Walk on Water? But they decided against that, possibly because of the religious connotations, and they settled on Aftermath.
You'll be seeing Mick Jagger doing a goose step on water. Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, exactly. I mean, you've just got so many connotations going on. But interesting enough, within '66, mid '66 now, the Stones did an American tour, finished in Hawaii, and they also did a UK tour. And what nobody realised at the time, that was the last tours with Brian Jones, for reasons that become apparent very quickly. And they hit more censorship problems in '67 on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were promoting their latest song, Let's Spend the Night Together, and the producers, the sensitivities, needed the song to have the lyric change so that Jagger sings, "Let's spend some time together."
Right, they didn't go the way of the Doors. They actually did what they were asked.
That's right. Yeah, the Doors famously a few months later were doing "Light My Fire," and Jim Morrison apparently agreed in the rehearsal and just sang the same lyrics anyway. But what's fun is that a week or so later, that was January the 15th, '67. On January the 22nd, '67, they appeared on the very prestigious UK Sunday Night at the London Palladium TV show. And that particular show, it had been on for years. And it climaxed with the stage itself had a rotating element. And famously, all of the acts and the chorus girls would all get on, and they'd be on this rotating center stage, and everybody would wave to the audience. But I think to try and get some street cred back, the Stones refused to get on the rotating stage and give the traditional wave at the end of that particular show.
And they took some heat for that, probably.
Oh, they did a bit. I mean, the national papers took a fairly dim view of, the youth of today not fitting in with tradition, as it were.
Those rotten kids and that rock and roll music.
Exactly. But why the Brian Jones thing all came about was there were a couple of serious drug busts. Mick and Keith were done in the February of '67. And they were convicted, but it was actually overturned on appeal. But in October '67, Brian Jones actually pleaded guilty to drugs charges, and that then gave them serious problems in terms of touring America, because a drugs bust made it very, very difficult to get the appropriate visas.
How things have changed, Derek. Now you're extra popular if you get busted for drugs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that was very much the beginning of the end of the Brian Jones years, basically. I mean, we've still got a couple of years when he's part of the band, but they don't do an awful lot. I mean, interestingly enough, in '67, they released the album Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Again, that was one of the ones on both sides of the Atlantic. And that was their first album to receive very mixed reviews.
Well, just the title's going to turn some people off, especially of the times.
Absolutely. But it was also their attempt at psychedelic music, and it didn't really work out. Though in the UK, the album was released with a great 3D sleeve that, again, is very collectible nowadays.
That's another thing of the times, Derek. Those bands were willing to experiment outside of their normal genre. That's something we don't see these days. These bands are very cookie cutter to their own styles these days. So that was something that gave that era its own defining situation, its own defining moments there.
That's right. And the record companies would actually stay with an artist over a few singles until they became successful, like with the Stones and the Beatles. It took the Beatles 3 singles to get to number 1 in the UK, and it took the Stones several singles before they got to the number 1 spot as well.
And what you're showing me here is they've got some more releases coming up as well. That was another thing. Bands released stuff on a regular basis back then. Which now it's 5-6 years sometimes for an artist to put a new album out.
That's right. Very much, an album would come out more or less every year, and singles until you get to the late 70s when singles were very uncool. People would typically put out 3 or 4 singles a year, every 3 months.
Right, and that's where we're heading in with the release of Jumping Jack Flash.
That's right. I mean, that was important because that was when they changed. Andrew Oldham had produced all of their singles up until that particular point. But this is the first time that Jimmy Miller was brought in, and he produced that particular single. So Andrew Loog Oldham is very much out of the Stones picture at this time now. But 68, the end of 68, I mean, we have talked about this before, so I won't dwell on it. They did their famous TV special, Rock and Roll Circus, that it never went out at the time because Mick Jagger thought that the Who had very much outperformed them. So it didn't actually get seen by anybody until a DVD release in 1996.
Now that was John Lennon. He was with a bunch of really good artists, and he was doing some other thing in that, right?
That's right. That was his first appearance outside of the Beatles. He called his band Dirty Mac, and that was Keith Richards on bass, Eric Clapton, and Mitch Mitchell from Jimi Hendrix on drums. And Lennon himself referred to himself when he introduced the band as Winston Leg Thigh, which is a great name. Yes. Great name. But it was also Brian Jones's last performance with the Stones, and it's also famous for Tony Iommi, who had a very, very short stay with Jethro Tull, because they were between guitarists. Mick Abrams had left after the first album. This was Jethro Tull, and Martin Barr hadn't quite joined, and he joined for the second album. And in between, Tony Iommi, who was in Earth at the time before they were called Black Sabbath, and David O'List from Nice. He had a short piece with them as well, but I'm not aware of any recordings that they made, because by the time they got to the second album, Martin Barr was the regular guitarist and was for a very long time to come.
I always thought that the one little guitar line in Aqualung had at least a little flavor of Tony Iommi, that down.
Yeah, oh, it's a great album.
I have no idea if they borrowed it from him, if he helped write it or whatever, but I always thought that even without knowing that history, that sounded like Tony Iommi.
Yeah.
And then Brian was sacked shortly after all that, right?
That's right. And the problem was, I mean, this is the sort of summer of '69 now, because they weren't really doing an awful lot. They couldn't get into America. They were moving away from the blues. He wanted to stay more with the blues, and he was sacked on June the 8th. And he wanted to join Lexis Corner, who, of course, he'd started life with, as it were. But Lexis Corner suggested that he should form his own band. But a few days later, July the 3rd, he actually died at his home in the swimming pool. The coroner actually recorded a verdict of misadventure, swimming under the influence of alcohol and drugs. But in 2009, there was a newspaper article in the UK to say, in a national newspaper, to say that the police had actually reopened the case, because there was always a lot of suspicion, conspiracy theories around the way he died.
But it's a tragic progression he went through, pleading guilty of drugs, and then within a few years later, he was sacked. And then he dies.
That's right. Yeah, it's really sad that it should have all ended like that. But that's, of course, then when Mick Taylor came to the fore, and Honky Tonk Woman, actually only released the day after, not deliberately timed like that, but happened to be that it was released on the 4th of July in the UK. And they famously played a free Hyde Park concert in London on the 5th. But interestingly enough, Honky Tonk Women is the last UK number one that the Stones have had, and they fared a bit better in America. Again, Honky Tonk Women was a hit, number one in '69, but then they had number ones with Brown Sugar in '71, Angie in '73, and Miss You in '78. And they're the last hits that number ones they've had in America.
Since you're talking since they haven't had one since.
That's right. Yeah, there's not one listed on Billboard since Miss You in '78.
Yet they still sell out shows, and they still are just fat. They're going on tour.
Absolutely, and we will get to that. But that's right. I mean, the Stones are interesting because they haven't had much in the way of highly rated albums since about Exile on Main Street, or in the early '70s and the middle '70s. Although their last album they released, Back to the Roots, was absolutely awesome. But they carried on lawsuits. Talking to lawsuits, '69. They filed a suit against Andrew Oldham and Eric Easton because of the Decca deal. They finally decided that that wasn't all that good for them. And in '69, they kicked off at their American tour. That was the first since that 1966 tour. And interestingly enough, they're supported by Tina Turner, but B.B. King and Chuck Berry. So the very people that had influenced them in the early days were now supporting them on major tours.
No, that would have been a great tour to see.
Oh, it would. And Terry Reid was one of the supporters as well. He was the guy that turned down the opportunity to be the lead singer for Led Zeppelin when Zeppelin was being put together.
And he's like, oh, what did I do that for?
Well, he must wonder occasionally, what if? I mean, there are some big what ifs in this life, and that's got to be one of them.
Yeah, but Zeppelin wouldn't have gotten anywhere without Robert Plant. He was Zeppelin in pretty much every way.
Absolutely. They're another one of these bands, like the Beatles and Stones and The Who, where the band itself is so much bigger than any of the individuals, and they just gelled absolutely, completely as a single unit.
Hey, you listening there. Don't go anywhere. The John Lebang Show is going to be right back. Just ask the hillbilly.
That's right. Right after this.
What about me? Maybe next time.
Powerful, epic music by Toothbox Row. Life-changing lyrics come in every style, empowering humanity to finally unlock the chains of bondage. Experience the edgy side of positive music and rock your world today. From Primal to Divine, available now at sassyalternativemusic.com.
If you want to contact the John Lebang Show, feel free to send an email to jlebang@live.com. And if you're on Twitter, look him up at John Lebang. And don't forget to go to his Facebook page at The John Lebang Show. Banger. Now here's John.
But that was the tour they recorded to Get Your Yah-Yahs Out. I think 9 of the 10 songs, certainly most of them, come from a couple of nights at the Madison Square Garden, where Janis Joplin got on stage one night to duet with Tina Turner. That would have been worth seeing.
Damn right.
I mean, technically not part of the tour, but they rounded off that American jaunt with the Altamonts concert on the 6th of December. And sadly, that's the one that ended with the death of Meredith Hunter, and often thought really as a spiritual end of the 1960s. They became tax exiles in 71. Income tax in the UK was 90%. So they had a goodbye Great Britain tour and went off to live in France. And that's the sort of time that Rolling Stones Records came into existence, and they released Brown Sugar, which was the first single on the Rolling Stones label.
And that was in 71, right?
71, yeah. And then more lawsuits. 71, there was a lawsuit with Alan Klein to try and get the rights to the songs back, but they didn't succeed in that. And then 72, they had their legendary American Exile on Main Street tour. And the Stones seem to have a history of 2 or 3 or 4 year gaps between tours, because that previous American tour had been the first since 66. This one's the first since 69. And this is the one that goes down in rock and roll legend, really. I mean, it had the concert film Ladies and Gentlemen, but they had tear gas. Police used tear gas at a concert in Tucson. They partied at Hugh Hefner's Playboy Mansion. Somebody put a bomb under one of the trucks and blew it up in Montreal. And Mick and Keith were arrested after a gig on the 18th of July for thumping a photographer.
Now, according to your notes, Stevie Wonder opened this tour?
That's right, yeah.
mean, can you? I just try to think about all the concerts I missed because I was either too young or wasn't even born.
Right.
Stevie Wonder and the Rolling Stones would have just been. I mean, and you're talking both bands or both groups in their prime.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Stevie Wonder in those days would have been absolutely awesome to see. Absolutely incredible. I mean, it just shows the stature of the Stones that you've got someone like Stevie Wonder who's more than happy to open for them. I mean, they were enormous by the time you get to the early 70s. I mean, they've been enormous, basically, for a very long time.
So what about this thumping of a photographer? Was he just in their face and they just couldn't stand it anymore? Paparazzi?
Yeah, I think so. I think he was just getting a little bit too close for comfort. And they took umbrage to it and gave him a bit of a slap, as they say.
Keith Richards, I love it!
Yeah, exactly. Oh, won't do that again. But, I mean, Mick Taylor, of course, we're coming to the end of the Mick Taylor era now, because that was a good era. There was some really good stuff, I think, when Mick Taylor was with them. Because, I mean, he's got a heck of a blues pedigree. And he left them, well, he actually left on the 12th of December, 74, and he joined the Jack Bruce Band. His last album with them was It's Only Rock and Roll. And Ron Wood joined them in 75. They had an upcoming American tour, and he joined to help out on the American tour, because he was technically still with the Faces. So when he wasn't playing with the Stones, he was playing with the Faces at that particular time. So that was quite a gig he got himself sorted out with in the middle 70s. But it wasn't a clear-cut thing, I think, that he was going to be the replacement, because the Black and Blue album features Harvey Mandel and Ron Wood, and I think the idea was that it came down to a choice between the two of them, because Harvey Mandel, of course, got a good pedigree, people like John Mayall again, and Canned Heat he was with for a while, and they both played 2 or 3 songs on the Black and Blue album, and it was after that Black and Blue album in 76 that Ron Wood joined as a permanent member.
Which they keep replacing members here to keep going, but the basic of the band, the foundation, still always was there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it was only the guitarist that was changing, unlike a lot of bands where they have quite a throughput of people. But sadly, I mean, we move on in quite big chunks now. And in 1985, Ian Stewart actually died. Sadly, died in the doctor's waiting room while he was waiting for an appointment. He had a heart attack. I suppose if you've got to go, that's the place to be. But
well,
I mean,
one place you want to be. There's a couple other places I'd rather be, but we won't talk about it here.
That's probably true. That's very true. But he's one of the real unsung heroes. I mean, he played a big part. He's credited on an awful lot of Stones albums and singles as playing on them. And he actually features on Led Zeppelin's Rock'n'Roll track on the 4th album. So he's a very highly rated guy. And then, of course, in 92, Bill Wyman left, and he was replaced by Darryl Jones. But you'll note that Darryl Jones is never referred to as a Rolling Stone, although he has played with them since he joined them in 92.
Is he still with them?
Yeah.
And he's still not referred to as a band member?
No, and if you look at the photographs of the Rolling Stones, you'll find it's Sans bass player. So I suppose it's because of the prime stuff really was very much before Bill Wyman left. But he's listed as a band member on the website, and on the website it says that he continues to play with them. So I couldn't find anything that suggested he wasn't going to be playing on this latest tour.
It just reminds me of the drummer situation with the latest Black Sabbath tour. He was the drummer from Ozzy's band, but they really never gave him credit as the Black Sabbath member.
I think it's probably because, I mean, these bands come out of the 60s and 70s, And I think people who join 20 years later, you just don't think of them. The band doesn't sort of think of them as being in that inner sanctum, as it were.
Sure, I understand.
But interestingly enough, Bill Wyman and Mick Taylor joined the Stones on stage in 2012 at their 50th anniversary show at the O2 Arena on the 25th of November 2012. That would have been a good gig to be at.
Now, that might have been one of the earliest internet broadcasts ever.
That's right, in 94. It is rated to be the first live internet broadcast by a major band, and that was in Dallas when they were doing a Voodoo Lounge concert. But if anybody's ever wondered why Richard Ashcroft isn't credited as the writer of the Bittersweet Symphony on Urban Hymns, it's because they sampled. Well, it was actually Andrew Oldham orchestra version of The Last Time, and Alan Klein took a dim view afterwards of how much they'd sampled, and he told them to either take Bittersweet Symphony and Urban Hymns off the market, or recredit it with Jagger and Richard as the writers. So if you actually look at it, if anybody's got a CD of that, if you check out the credits, you'll find that the songwriting credit for Bittersweet Symphony goes to just Jagger and Richards.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. But now we come right up to 2016 and the last album they released, and that was their first studio album in over a decade. Album called Blue and Lonesome, and no Jagger Richard compositions. It's back to the sort of first album time with covers of a lot of the blues legends, Willie Dixon and the like.
And that's their most recent album, and that's...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, now we're at the tour, and you can see them. They're at Dublin, across the UK and Europe. Kick off on May the 17th, and the dates at the moment are to July the 8th. But if you look at the website, you'll see a couple of those dates indicated as recently added. Oh, and they'll sell everywhere out, because everybody knows that. I mean, Jagger is 74 or 75,
and he's still. I mean, how? And Keith Richards is what, 250, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, he should have been dead years ago. But I mean, one embodiment of the rock and roll myth. I mean, the guy is awesome.
And everything you told me tonight, Derek, and told the listeners, you can find everything except the tour dates from your book, right? Inside your book?
That's right. Rock'n'Roll Unravelled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots right through to mid-70s punk. So virtually all of these stories today are taken straight out of the book. And the tour dates, of course, and information you can get on the website. So it's all there somewhere to be had in the wonderful world of Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
And your website is rock'n'rollunraveled.com.
That's right.
And you're on Twitter and Facebook and all those other great places, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Facebook is Rock'n'Roll Unravelled, and Twitter is RNR Unravelled. And there's lots of information about this and other things on there as well.
Any final words before I let you go, Derek?
Just one thing. If you happen to be in the UK, and particularly if you happen to be in the north of England, I'm doing a book signing in Leeds at a book and record fair on the 14th of April in Leeds at the Kirkgate Market. So that should be fun.
Yeah, we'll be looking forward to seeing those pictures, because I just can't. I'll try to make it, but that's a long drive, and there's a big pond in the way. And,
exactly.
But I'm sure you'll be posting pictures and stuff. I mean, you are very active on the social media in general. Well, Derek, I thank you again for joining us this month. We'll see you again next month, and I'm sure you're going to have more interesting rock and roll history for us to just absorb.
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. It's been really good fun.
That was Derek Shelmerdine of Rock'n'Roll Unravelled.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff. Tune in again time, same space, same station.